This is Biology 2, Chapter 15, Part 4 on evolution. In this portion of the video lecture, we will be taking a look at the different types of natural selection as well as patterns of evolution. Now, when we talk about natural selection, we can take a look at any trait. And remember, in any population, there is variation. That's one of the principles of natural selection. So when the population shows that individuals with an average form of a trait has an advantage in terms of reproduction and survival, and the extreme forms are at a disadvantage, that is a population that is undergoing stabilizing selection because it's becoming more average and more stable. This usually happens in populations that are very well adapted to their environment. They have a particular role or niche, and they fit that perfectly. This is the most common type of natural selection that occurs. So on the left side, we see the normal population. So there's our bell curve, extremes on either end, average in the middle. In stabilizing selection, that population squeezes in from the extremes to become more average. Directional selection is where the population is going to change to one extreme form of the trait. So individuals with one extreme form has an advantage. So directional selection acts to favor one particular trait. So everything else is at a disadvantage. Eventually, over time, what will happen is the whole population will change towards that one extreme end, and that will become the new average. So in a normal population, what happens with directional selection is the whole bell curve of traits moves to one extreme or the other. Disruptive selection is what happens when individuals with either one of the extreme forms of the trait are at an advantage in terms of reproduction and survival. So in this case, the average trait has the disadvantage. What will happen over time is the population can change towards both extreme forms, and that average will disappear. If this happens long enough, disruptive selection can actually lead to making a new species. So from a normal population, what happens is kind of camel humps. The average goes down and both extremes will be more prevalent in the population. Now, sexual selection is an interesting type of selection. It can be stabilizing, directional, or disruptive. It all depends on the preferential choice of a mate based on a specific trait. Usually in sexual selection, the females will pick. So whichever male has the best form of the trait, they get to mate, and those best traits then are passed on generation to generation. Speciation is what we call in evolution when we have a new species being formed. Allopatric speciation is where a population is divided by some kind of physical barrier. So the populations on either side of the barrier become less and less similar until they eventually branch out into a new species. The image that you see on the bottom there, the middle is the Grand Canyon. On the right, you have the desert squirrel. On the left, you have the kaibab squirrel. They were a part of one population. They do look a little bit similar, but because the Grand Canyon split that population many generations ago, the population could not hop the barrier and interbreed anymore. And so we have two different species of squirrels on either side of the Grand Canyon. Sympatric speciation is speciation that occurs where there's no physical barrier. So both the ancestral population and the new species will live side by side. The diagram at the bottom shows, even though they look very, very similar, two different populations of flies that happen to prefer different types of apples in the same orchard. There are different sugar and acidity levels of these apples, and each species, even though they can pick whichever apple tree they want to go to, still split on preference of one type of apple over another. Patterns of evolution, how we can see how this is shaped, either by current modern life or by ancient life. Adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is where one population species gives rise to many different species in a fairly short amount of time. The African cichlid fish that you see down here each have a type of mouth part based on what they eat. So because of the food resources, we have one species, the original cichlid population has branched out and radiated out into several different species. Usually adaptive radiation arises after the creation of a new habitat or after a large-scale extinction event, or the founder effect, where a small group of the population leaves and goes to a new place. Adaptive radiation happens because these new habitats have new resources, and so the population will radiate out to find a niche for each type of resource. Coevolution usually happens between predator and prey relationships. It's where the evolution of one species affects the evolution of another. And sometimes we call this the coevolutionary arms race. So once predator gets better, prey becomes better, then predator becomes better, then prey becomes better, and it keeps going back and forth and back and forth. Convergent evolution is how we can see that even though animals or plants can be very unrelated, they can evolve similar traits because they tend to be in the same type of environment or biome. So this demonstrates how species in similar environments look or behave in very similar ways. So between the placental mammals and the marsupial mammals, there are an example and a representative of each type of mammal based on the niche that it has. They tend, again, to look very similar because they live in the same types of ecosystems. So how fast does evolution occur? Well, from what we can tell both through the fossil record, which is our only physical evidence of evolution, and through modern techniques such as comparative anatomy and biochemistry, we can take a look at how this happens in two ways. Darwin's idea and kind of a traditional view of how evolution is thought to work is gradualism. So evolution would proceed in very slow, gradual steps. So kind of like the tortoise in the tortoise and the hare race. Slow and steady will eventually get you to where you want to go. Now, punctuated equilibrium is more like the hare in the tortoise and the hare. The hare would race ahead and then take a little nap and then race ahead again. So punctuated equilibrium shows no genetic change followed by a very short amount of time where there's very many changes. Stephen Jay Gould developed this kind of view. It's more a modern view of evolution, but many scientists still kind of blend the two together. Some species will show that gradual change, and others show a kind of a punctuated equilibrium. This has been Chapter 15, Part 4 on evolution.